I want to talk first about copying, because copying is foundational. Copying is part of what it means to be alive 4 billion years ago, thanks to a process that we still don't entirely understand. Some molecules figured out how to copy themselves. We are their descendants. Because we have a name for things that don't copy themselves, we call them dead, and we call them extinct. Copying is foundational to what it means to be human, right? Because we are descended from very prolific copiers, and so copying is really there kind of right from the beginning. So about 4 years ago, my daughter was born. 4.5 years ago, my daughter was born. I live in London. My parents live in Canada. And a couple of weeks after she was born, my parents came over for a visit. My mom has a doctorate in early childhood education, so she's like a baby whisperer. And so she got there and she said, have you stuck your tongue out at her yet? And I said, no, Mom, I haven't stuck my tongue out at my newborn yet. Why would I stick my tongue out at my newborn? She said, oh, just watch this. So she took my daughter in her arms, right? And she looked at her and she went like this. And my daughter, 2 weeks old, awfully cute, not very coordinated, hadn't yet actually touched her tongue, really hadn't seen the mirror, didn't know really that she had a tongue or what it was for, but she looked up at her grandmother and did this. Because we copy like we nuzzle for the breast, right? I mean, it's there, right? It's there from the minute we emerge. Copying is how we learn to make art. Copying is how we learn to do language. So copying and to draw things and how we learn to do all that other stuff. So, the first story I ever wrote in 1977, I was 6 years old. There weren't a lot of sophisticated stories that had multiple points of view, stories that had non-linear timelines and so on available to kids, because we just had, 1 or 2 over-the-air channels in Toronto. There weren't VCRs, there weren't DVD players. So my dad took me to see Star Wars, and it was like the most complicated story I'd ever seen at that point, right? I mean, it was like a revelation, it just blew my mind. So I got home and I wanted to figure out how that story worked. So I took some A4 and I stapled it up the side and I trimmed it to the size of a mass market paper book, because I knew that's what a book was. And I just wrote out that story over and over again, like a kid playing scales on a piano. Because copying's how we learn to do art. I mean, amateurs plagiarize, artists steal. Art always stops with copying, art always involves copying. And what we do is we say, oh, well, the bit that we copied, that was plumbing, and the bit that we added, that was art, right? So Cervantes, he invented the novel unless it was someone else, because of course all the great inventions are invented simultaneously by lots of people all around the world, because when it's railroad time you get railroading. But that's not to say that Cervantes didn't do something important when he invented the novel independent of all those other people who invented novels. So Cervantes invented the novel, and every time I write a novel I copy Cervantes. But I don't acknowledge him as the proper person to acknowledge for having written novels, because it's plumbing now, right? Edgar Allan Poe invented the detective story, and when I write detective stories, I don't go, I'm writing a Poean detective story. But Poe, he's just plumbing now. He doesn't get any kind of accolade, because it came before me, so it's plumbing. The part I add is important. The stuff they did, it's not important. And that's not enough. Obviously, we need a better conception than that. And so from time to time, we come up with rules to regulate what kind of copying can happen when within the contours of the supply chain of the entertainment industry. And we call that copyright. It's a regulatory framework for an industry. And there's nothing wrong with regulation for industry. I mean, for example, I'd love it if the finance industry had some real meaningful regulation, right? But imagine this. Imagine that we say, okay, we're going to give meaningful regulation to finance, and the way that we're going to test whether or not you are doing something financial is whether $1 million changes hands in a transaction. When $1 million changes hands in a transaction, you've got to go tell the banking regulator about it so they can make sure nothing untoward is going on. And then, Eurozone collapse, worldwide commodity spikes, hyperinflation, and now you need a wheelbarrow full of dollars to buy a pint, right? So $1 million every time you want to buy a sandwich, $1 million every time you want to buy a pint. So you buy your friend a sandwich. According to the finance rules, you're now a bank. So do we say, okay, we've had hyperinflation, it takes $1 million to buy a sandwich, therefore everyone who buys a sandwich is a bank? Or do we say, that test that we used to have before something that was rare, $1 million, became ubiquitous, to determine whether or not you were in the industry, that test no longer works. I think if we had a sane regulation, we'd say, okay, the test no longer works. But copying is what we use to test whether or not you're in the entertainment industry, right? We say, oh, are you making a copy? Then you're doing something industrial related to entertainment, right? Because to make a copy of a movie, you need like $1 million movie factory. And to make a copy of a record, you need a record studio. And to make a copy of a book, you need a printing press. And so the way we test whether or not you're within copyright's remit is whether you're doing something industrial, and copying is an inherently industrial act. Therefore, everybody who copies is in the industry and should be governed by copyright's regulations. And then along comes the computer. And the computer is a kind of hyperinflation for copying, because everything a computer does starts and ends with copying, right? We say that, like, I stream the file to you, but I didn't give you a download. This is wrong, right? There is no such thing as a stream that doesn't involve a download, because all a stream is I send you a copy of the file, and then I believe, maybe erroneously, that your computer doesn't have a Save As button to save the file. But like, the only way you can see a movie or hear a song that's on my server with your computer is if your computer gets a copy of it, right? The internet's not made out of tubes and mirrors. The internet is made out of bits. And so to get a copy from here to there, or to get the signal from here to there, there has to be a copy made of it. And in fact, not just one copy, but copies and copies and copies and copies and copies and copies and copies. Copies to the frame buffer, copies to the RAM, copies to the graphics buffer, copies to the network buffers, copies to all over the place, right? Just like so many copies that they are uncountable. Millions of copies every day before breakfast. So are we now all part of the entertainment industry? I don't think so. And I think that's the problem, right? Collectively, the people in this room have probably made more copies this year than everybody in the world had made up to the moment when the first, like, non-literary, real, properly speaking 20th century copyright law came into effect, which was when they licensed sound recordings in 1908 in America, the piano roll laws. So that's how many copies we've made. I don't think that we are collectively the entertainment industry. I mean, some of us may be participants in it, but I think that when you, like, watch a video of your kid that you uploaded to YouTube so your parents on the other side of the world could see it, that you are engaged in something industrial and should be regulated the same way a record label is. So the problem with getting that wrong is that because we copy like we breathe today, and because copyright regulation regulates copyright, the stakes have become really high in copyright regulation, right? If we get it wrong, we don't just regulate the entertainment industry and maybe do it violence that it doesn't deserve or screw it up in some important way, but we also end up screwing up all the other things we do that involves copying, which is everything we do that involves the internet and computers. So I want to get beyond rules about whether copyright is good or bad tonight, and I want to dig into a meatier question. I want to dig into what do we want copyright to do, and how do we design a copyright that does it? So I want to start with something that I think many people would agree with, a relatively uncontroversial idea. If you're designing an industrial regulation for the entertainment industry, if you're designing copyright, it should serve as an as an incentive to creativity. Right? A good copyright system results in works being made, creative works being made, more people making more works. It serves creators. Right? That may not be its alpha and omega, but that's at least one of the important facets of copyright. So 15 years ago, the world's governments started looking at the question of modernizing copyright for the 21st century, for the digital age. And the first order of business was to see to it that things that prevented copying, technologies that prevented copying, and these trade under a lot of different names, digital rights management or digital locks, or technical protection measures. I'll just call them digital locks through this talk, because I think it expresses pretty well what they are. That digital locks should receive very special protection, and that breaking digital locks should become a kind of new offense that's separate from any kind of copyright infringement, that the act of removing the lock becomes an offense, or the act of making tools to remove locks becomes an offense. So this started at WIPO. WIPO is the UN agency that produces the world's copyright rules, the World Intellectual Property Organization. It has the same relationship to bad copyright that Mordor has to evil. It's kind of the eternal wellspring of every dumb copyright rule we've ever had. And in 1996, WIPO created the WIPO Copyright Treaty, the WCT, and it said that nations should create a special kind of protection for digital locks. And in the US, it became the 1998 Digital Millennium Copyright Act, DMCA. You've probably gone to a YouTube video and said this video has been removed because of the DMCA. That's the DMCA. The Australian version came into law as part of the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement. And, you know, if you want trade with the US, you have to adopt this treaty in 2004. It's in your national law. But Australian copyright law and the DMCA don't just do what the WIPO Copyright Treaty demands, which is to say it's against the law to break a copyright, a digital lock if you're infringing copyright. They actually go further than that. They say it's against the law to remove a digital lock under any circumstances unless you're the person who put it there, unless you're the company that made the lock. So these rules cease to become rules about works, creative works, and they become rules about locks. So what does that mean? Well, if you're a user of a copyrighted work, and that's where this discussion usually goes, right? Like if you're the person who's got the region locked DVD and it won't play on your DVD player, or if you're the person who's got the ebook that won't play, it means that even if the law says you're allowed to back this up or you're allowed to move this from this device to that, you can't, right? And that's what people usually say, and they say, oh, that's very objectionable, and we should fix that. But that's not the major thing I'm going to talk about tonight, although it's worth noting that the most voracious consumers of information are creators of information. Remember, all creativity starts with copying, right? There's a reason that if your author photo on the jacket of your book isn't you standing on a windswept tarn looking kind of out at infinity, it's probably you standing in front of a bookcase, right? Because like, this is how you say, I've done my homework, right? Look at all the people I stole from to write this book. And so as prolific users of creative works, rules that restrict how you use creative works bind creators especially. But there's a secondary effect that's much subtler and much more drastic. It means that DRM companies, digital lock companies, get a greater say over the works that we produce and the works that our publishers or labels or studios invest in than we do and that our investors get. So consider the iTunes Store for a minute. The iTunes Store no longer has DRM on music, but it has mandatory DRM for video and audiobooks. And by mandatory, I mean that if a rights holder goes to Apple and says, I would like to sell some video in your store without your DRM, or I would like to sell an audiobook in your store without DRM, Apple says, no, we will only allow these works to be sold with DRM. And that is not just individual rights holders, but very big ones. Random House, who do my audiobooks, who, as you probably know, owned by Bertelsmann, largest publisher in the world, asked them to distribute my audiobooks without DRM. They refused. So, and it's not that they need to develop new technology. The stuff they give away doesn't have DRM, the podcasts and stuff. It's literally like they just won't click the no DRM checkbox for these kinds of works. And they control 90% of the audiobook market, Audible and iTunes. And so imagine that you're a big audiobook publisher and you sell a couple of $1 million worth of audiobooks through the Apple channel. So they're locked with Apple's proprietary technology, and only Apple can authorize your customers, the people who bought this work, to remove the DRM. And so along comes a spunky startup, and they go, we've got technology that's as good as iTunes for distributing audiobooks, and we're going to give you a better discount. You get to keep more of the money. We're not going to ask for as big a discount as iTunes does, and better terms, and better reporting, and just we're better in every way, which is what startups do. I mean, it's what iTunes did to all the companies that sold music on the internet before iTunes came along, right? So someone comes along and they make you this offer, and you go, great, I'm going to shift to you guys. And Apple says, well, wait a second. If you shift to those guys, we're not going to authorize your customers, who at this point are our customers, to remove our DRM to play in their players. If you want your customers, your new customers, to have audiobooks in their format, they're going to have to maintain a separate parallel infrastructure. They're going to have their own player in there. It's like having to have a different bookcase for every bookstore you shop in. Right? So as the investor and as the writer, you've kind of lost control of the destiny over your works. You've lost control over the way that the most important rights, one of the most important rights in copyright was the right to authorize people to follow from one platform to another. You've lost that, and it's accrued to someone else. So, you know, who gets the lion's share of copyright? Who gets to say, yes, you're allowed to copy this file made up of my precious, expensive to produce creative bits? Well, it's not the creator, and it's not the investor, it's the digital lock vendor. And the digital lock vendor is not an important participant in the creative act here, which is what copyright's supposed to be protecting. I mean, the digital rights vendor may have done something very clever, but that clever thing amounts to manufacturing a skinny piece of electronics in a Pacific Rim sweatshop and taking my file and putting it on it, right? And I understand why they may want some rules to help them, but I don't understand why they should be the entertainment industry supply chain rules, why that should be the most important person in the entertainment industry supply chain, because surely that's not the important bit of the audiobook, right? Surely it was either writing the book that went into it or recording the book and investing in it, not manufacturing the skinny bit of electronics that'll be on the, you know, e-waste heap in 18 months. So this is not copyright as a friend of creators. This is copyright as like a platform owner's best friend. Now the funny thing is that it wouldn't be hard to write a digital lock rule that didn't produce this outcome, right? All you'd have to say is, it's against the rules to break a digital lock unless you're not violating copyright otherwise. And since there's no copyright that says you can't shelve the book from vendor A on the bookcase from vendor B, that would always be legal. But that's not what your legislature and none of the legislatures I work in, I'm Canadian and I live in Britain and I used to work for Americans, none of those legislatures did. They all got it wrong. What they've actually said, instead of will protect copyright with digital locks, is what they've said is whatever the digital lock locks up, whether it locks up a use that's legal or illegal, up or down, left or right, we'll spend an infinite number of tax dollars to make sure that nobody ever disrupts that business model. So what company wouldn't take up the government on that offer, right? What DRM vendor wouldn't rub their hands together and say, great, it's like the world's greatest subsidy for anything we can think up and convince people to do. It's a law prohibiting people from disrupting us. It's awesome. So some companies have figured out how to play this like virtuosos, and Apple is one of them. Apple's whole iOS ecosystem is kind of an exhibit A of how laws that protect digital locks instead of copyright can go wrong. So they use digital locks to ensure that only apps bought from the App Store can run on their platform. So what that means is that if you write an app, and I have an iPad, and I want to give you money for the app, unless Apple says that the app is allowed to run on my iPhone or iPad, and unless I promise to give 30% of the money to Apple, copyright law says that the person who created a creative work isn't allowed to sell it to the customer who wants to pay for it. That's crazy, right? I mean, that's just like not what copyright law is for. You're not allowed to sell creative works to willing customers unless a company in Cupertino says so. I mean, that can't be what we made copyright law for, right? That's got to be a bug and not a feature. Now, every time people do opt into that ecosystem, it strengthens the lock that Apple has on the platform, because it becomes the place that people go to, because the platform has lots of apps on it, and then that's the place that you have to send your apps. And the more power Apple gets, the more marketplace power they get, unsurprisingly, the more marketplace muscle they flex. So when Apple kicked this all off, it was, you have to give us 30% of the money the customer gives you when they buy your app. Now the deal is, you have to give us 30% of the money the customer gives you when they buy your app, and if they spend any more money using your app, you have to give us 30% of that too. Now that's pretty clearly a totally different deal from 30% from the person who buys your app, and it's pretty obvious like why they did it, because they make more money and because nobody has any market power to stop them. So why wouldn't they do it, right? They're not running a charity. What I don't understand is why we as creators, A, didn't see this coming, and why, more importantly, our supposedly wily investors, you know, the publishers, the studios, the record labels, why they didn't see this coming, and more importantly, why lawmakers set this up. Why did they give us a copyright law that gives this mere intermediary a bunch of market power they don't need and that doesn't end up promoting creativity, although it does certainly promote multi-billion-dollar valuations?